Hello, this is the Reverend Dr. Duane Alexander Miller in Madrid, and I am very pleased to be speaking with Abdul Haqq. That's a pen name for a colleague of mine who has written a very interesting book called The Quran's Difficult Verses Explained with Commentaries, Hadith, Biographies, and History. How are you doing today, Abdul Haqq?
Thank you very much. I'm doing great. It's great to be with you.
Great. So just first of all, why did you choose the pen name Abdul Haqq? I mean, I know what it means, but I think most of our listeners are not going to know the Arabic as well as you or I do.
Well, I don't know it even a fraction of as well as you do, but my understanding it means servant or slave of the truth.
Yes, that's right.
And
Haqq is the truth, or the one who is true. It's one of the characteristics of Allah in Islam. And of course, it's also very famously something that Jesus says about himself, Ana huwa al-haq, I am the truth. I'm the truth, the way, and the life. John 14:6, I want to say. But yeah, the servant or the slave of the truth. So that is a beautiful name, both for Muslims and for Christians, and I imagine for Jews as well.
Yeah, so I like I went through several possibilities, and that's where I landed.
Good, good. Well, first of all, tell us, briefly, what inspired you to write this book? I mean, there's a lot of commentaries on the Quran and a lot of tafsir. You cite a ton of them. We'll get to that down the road. What was it that you saw going on in the world today, and in maybe your own context, and as so far as you can talk about that you thought like this is a book that has to be written?
Well, actually, I have had the thought of writing this book for probably 20 years. And, as I encountered both Muslims and Christians throughout the years, I found just a not necessarily shocking, but a notable ignorance of what the Quran actually says, what it teaches. I think the genesis of this was I was in a major Middle Eastern city in a curio shop and looking at the little evil eye symbols that adorn so much of the jewelry and picture frames and these things. And a young man came up beside me, and I can't remember the genesis of the conversation. We started chatting, and he told me that this evil eye thing was all superstition, and the Quran had dispelled any notion of the evil eye and all of this superstition. And I knew that that wasn't true, but I couldn't call to mind the precise surah of the Quran at the moment, so I kind of let it pass. But I remembered thinking, he sounds so confident that he knows this, and it's wrong. The Quran does affirm the reality of the evil eye. But I just sort of filed it away. And then some years later, I was conversing with the president of a Muslim Students Association at a major US university. And somehow we got onto the topic of child marriage. And I asserted that the Quran approved of child marriage. And this person became instantly angry and just in no uncertain terms denied that the Quran would ever teach such a thing, that it was an enlightenment and an elevation of women, and it was the standard type of commentary about what the Quran was about. And I think at the time I was able to quote the verse and provide a little bit of commentary, and then the conversation abruptly ended. So again, I was taken by the lack of knowledge or understanding of what's in the Quran. Of course, in these instances, these were by Muslims. And many times over the years, when the subject of honor killings, for instance, comes up, you hear round agreement among all Muslim commentators that this is cultural only. It has nothing to do with Islam. It has nothing to do with the Quran. It's just a cultural practice, which is not true. It is affirmed in the Quran. So I thought, there's so much misunderstanding, lack of knowledge, lack of information. And a few times I would ask a Muslim friend about some verse in the Quran that was, troubling to me, or I thought might be problematic, very respectfully and humbly, never in a gotcha type of way. And there was always oh, well, that's a bad translation. It doesn't really mean that in the Arabic. And if I said, well, no, actually, it does mean this in the Arabic. This is a translation into English by a Muslim translator. Then they would say, well, but the scholars and the commentaries have all explained that away, and it's not really an issue. So eventually I thought, I need to write this book and pull out some of these verses and go excerpt what the commentaries say, both the classic and the modern. Where do hadith speak to the meaning of this verse? What might be found in Ibn Ishaq, the Sirat al-Rasul, the biography, the oldest and most authoritative biography of Muhammad's life. And then also occasionally refer to Tabari's history. And so I began working on it, and then I had a friend, young man, who is very interested in Islam and the Quran and he's a very intellectual type guy. And he said, hey, I'm going to be reading Surah 5 with one of my Muslim friends. They invited me to read the Quran with them. What are the verses in Surah 5 that might be problematic, that I could point out, that we might camp out on? And I said, okay, I just have to write this book. It's time. So as you know, writing a book, you really have to set aside the rest of your life, for a period of time, and just dive in and do nothing but that and focus and get the rough draft written, or the book never happens. And so
yeah, it's not like, painting the fence or whatever, where you can kind of devote a couple of hours every couple of weeks to it. I remember when I was writing Two Stories of Everything, I would like take entire weekends off, just go stay at a little crummy motel on the Gulf Coast of Texas, and I would just sit down and, I would basically spend all morning writing and editing, and then I'd spend most of the afternoon just doing editing and reading and preparing and outlining for the next day. So that was my experience with Two Stories of Everything, and I've got two other books, so that's similar for both of those. Yeah, I love that. I love what you're saying, and I've had similar experiences. I've been at evangelical Christian churches where I said things like, "Well, of course, the Crusades are not at all like jihad, because the Crusades were something that was tried by the Western Church for a couple of centuries." Much in response to a request for help. These were not wars of aggression in and of themselves. They were trying to recuperate lands that had been taken away. And then the Christians realized that this is not compatible with our faith, and so they stopped doing them. And jihad is not at all like that. It's kind of like a perpetual, permanent command until the entirety of the dunya, or the world, submits to Allah. And I think this is just very clearly academically true. I think if I were an atheist, I think I could totally affirm what I just said, and somebody got totally ticked off at me.
Yeah, that's another one. There's a common refrain that I hear increasingly now, is that jihad is an inner struggle. That's the greater jihad. And this violent expansionist jihad is not Islam. It's not in the Quran. It's just any kind of verse that might sound like it was commanding a perpetual violent expansion. It really wasn't perpetual. It was just limited to some very specific historical context and has no application today. So as you've seen, I think it's chapter 6 in the book, I don't know how many of the verses having to do with violence and jihad, but that I address, but I just take them one at a time and provide the commentary and both classic and modern commentary on what those verses mean. And I think it's inescapable for any fair reader that the Quran commands this perpetual violent expansion for the cause of the religion. And it is not limited in any way to some precise historical context, similarly to the conquest of Canaan by the Jews or anything like that. So
Yeah.
I'm trying not to be tendential in the book. I'm trying to be, let the sources speak for themselves. And what does the Quran really say? And what do these commentators and scholars say? And just let it be an educational experience for Muslims, Christians, and anyone else who really wants to know what these verses are all about.
Yeah, and I thought that was something that I appreciated about your tone. I mean, your tone is not polemic, but you gather together these scholars from Al-Jalalain to, Ibn Ishaq, the really early stuff, to later on, Ali Dashti, I love Ali Dashti, Sayyid Qutb, I've read his milestones. I mean, you've got a whole panoply of commentators who are very influential. I mean, for a Christian, I think a Christian would have to understand what if somebody wrote a commentary on Romans and they're grabbing stuff from anywhere from, Justin Martyr and St. Augustine down to the Middle Ages, St. Dominic and St. Benedict, and then to the Reformation, Calvin, the Counter-Reformation, Ignatius of Loyola, then up through modernity, Bultmann, and then up, like that sort of kind of range, I think is one of the strengths of the book. If you have it there with you, can you read to us the names of the chapters? Because I thought that was striking, and I think it's important just how all-encompassing this book is. I mean, it really addresses, I don't want to say the entirety of the Quran, but it really does address many of the key facets that we could identify in the Quran. If you don't have it there, I have my copy here, but
No,
if you
I
have
do
it there,
have it.
please.
Well, of
Yeah,
course, chapter 1 is the
great. Go ahead and read us
introduction.
the table of contents.
Chapter 1 is the introduction, where we talk about what Islam says about the Quran, what the Quran says about itself. We talk about who the commentaries are by, etc. And then chapter 2, the Quran and women, the Quran and alleged borrowing, the Quran and science, the Quran and history, the Quran and violence part 1, the Quran and violence part 2, the Quran and human thought, the Quran and Muhammad's problems, the Quran and superstition, and the Quran and the Arabic language. And so I anticipated a response that says, well, you've only dealt with problem verses. Why don't you talk about, the overarching message of the Quran? And I'm saying, yeah, but that's not the purpose of the book. The purpose is to deal with the quote unquote difficult verses. So, there, as you mentioned off the top, there are innumerable commentaries and articles and books about all various aspects of the Quran. But I wanted to bring all these together in one place, because I also find that even among Christians and Jews and people of other faiths that have holy books, when we encounter a verse that we don't quite understand or doesn't hit us quite right, we sort of dismiss it as a one-off. Like that's, I'm sure that has a very nice meaning if I dove into the commentaries in the Greek and, did proper hermeneutical practices, we'd figure that out. But I don't really have time for that right now. And so, there are puzzling or hard to understand verses or difficult verses in a lot of scriptures, but it is common for us to not properly assess the weight of those verses when we encounter them one here and then a month later somewhere else. But if we draw them all together, bring them all together, I think it provides a much more cogent, coherent examination of the topic.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and touch on one of those verses that you addressed. Now, this is a verse that I've literally heard quoted on, I think, CNN. and it was after some sort of terrorist attack, and some guy came on. He was the imam of the big mosque, and this is the verse that he quotes, saying Islam is totally against, and the Quran teaches us to be totally against violence. So this is Quran 5. That's Al-Ma'idah. That's the fifth chapter right there. Al-Ma'idah, for those who are listening, it means kind of the feast or the table, and it's talking about how Jesus summoned a great feast for his disciples. So I would say, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Abdul Haqq, I would say just a corruption of a much verbalized and kind of handed down story of probably the feeding of the 5,000 or something along those lines. Anyway, Quran 5:32 says, because of that, we ordained for the children of Israel that if anyone killed a person not in relation of murder or to spread mischief in the land, it would be as if he killed all mankind. And if anyone saved a life, it would be as if he saved the life of all mankind. So, I mean, how can you read Quran 5:32 and say that, there is genuine violence carried out by Muslims who sincerely believe in the Quran? How can any Muslim who sincerely believes in 532 then go out and carry out some sort of act of violence? So just briefly take us through how you handle that verse. Our purpose here in this brief interview is not to give a full, course on the entire book, but just to give some examples so that people, I hope, will buy the book, read it, and test it out for themselves. And so, yeah, 532.
Okay, well, I think the gist of that verse turns on the definition of murder. And without getting in too tall of the weeds, murder has a specific meaning in Sharia, Islamic law, different than in the West, where it is the unjustified taking of another person's life. In Islam, it is killing another Muslim without proper cause. And so it does not include the killing of non-Muslims. So that is part of it. And then when you have a command to jihad, which is the violent expansion of Islam, that cannot include or be prohibited by one verse that talks about murder. So part of the debate within Islam and among terrorists and jihadis and Islamists is what happens in the course of committing violent jihad, a terrorist act, a bombing, a killing, or something else, when a Muslim happens to get caught up into that violence and is killed. And so some would say, that means what you did was wrong and contrary to the Quran. And then other voices would say, no, that's, the overall purpose of this was to obey the Quran. And if this was just sort of an unfortunate collateral damage, that's too bad. Others say,
and sorry, let me just jump in here. You reference in the book that this appears to be drawn out of the Jewish Talmud, which I had not realized, like I did not know that, but this appears to be a quote or maybe a kind of loosely like a paraphrase of the Talmud talking about, Cain and Abel. So I mean, just for me,
yes.
that was totally new. In addition to the things you were saying about murder, meaning that yes, and again, this is not polemic. I'm not being mean. I'm not being a jerk to Muslims when I say this, but the Islamic Sharia, as traditionally constructed, says that Muslims khair al-umam, the best of all peoples, and they're better than the people of the book, or the Jews and the Christians, and maybe some other peoples who are better than, the atheists and the pagans who really don't have any right to exist at all. So I mean, that's just the traditional kind of theological sociology of Islamic Sharia.
Well, you're very correct. This in chapter 3, the Quran and alleged borrowing, and I entitled it "Alleged Borrowing" on purpose. These are the allegations made by non-Muslims or critics within Islam or whatever. People say this was borrowed from the Talmud, and the Quran misses the context and does not talk about Cain and Abel, whereby so early in human civilization, there were so few people that if you kill one person, it's like you've killed them and all the progeny that would come from that person for thousands of years into the future. So it's as if you've killed all mankind. But the Quran misses that context and just quotes the verse as a standalone. And we find actually quite a bit of evidence of material in the Quran that appears to be borrowed from pre-existing non-revealed literature. So, the Talmud, Jews don't say that's revelation. The Torah is the revelation. This is commentary. And so it would be quite odd indeed that the Quran should have material identical to or almost identical to material from pre-existing non-revealed literature. And so chapter 3 walks through a number of instances, and you've rightly pointed out one that that appears that the Quran just borrowed pretty much straight from the Talmud there.
Yeah, yeah. Again, I'm still learning stuff myself, obviously, and that was something that I had not caught on to before. Well, let me ask you, just kind of zooming out. You cite a whole bunch of different commentators and scholars from across the entire history of Islam, really. Let me ask you, is there one guy, or I don't recall seeing any women commentators, but any one guy that you thought was like, this is, maybe I presumably don't agree with him as you're not a Muslim, but one person who you thought, this is particularly like an astute and intelligent and insightful commentator on the Quran?
My personal view, Ibn Kathir is far more in-depth and draws on a lot more sources in providing his commentary. So I've always been impressed by Ibn Kathir, and probably shortly behind him would be Al-Jalalain from among the classic commentaries. The modern commentaries are actually quite fascinating, Qutb and Maududi, for instance, because they are products of, our time with, a modern education. They're very intelligent, brilliant men. And so they wrestle with a lot of these verses in a much different way than the classic commentators do. So I really appreciated, for instance, Maududi and his treatment of a lot of the material. And he very often would acknowledge, this is problematic for one reason or another, and then try to come up with an explanation or an excuse or a reason why it really shouldn't be seen as problematic. So he wrestled a whole lot more with the material from the Quran than the classic guys did. They just kind of, here it is, here's what it means, here's why it means that, here are the earlier scholars or companions and what they said. And so there was much less wrestling with the material and more just straightforward, here's what it means. And so I would answer your question probably by saying, in the classic commentaries, Ibn Kathir, and in the modern, Maududi.
Oh, that's okay. That's great. I was hoping you'd go with Ali Dashti. Ali Dashti I'm a fan of Ali Dashti. He was a secular Iranian.
I love him. And
Yeah.
His book, 23 Years, is a classic. I have had Iranians ask me in very hushed tones outside the hearing of others, hey, do you happen to have a copy of that? Could you get me a copy of that? Because it's illegal. in Iran. So I'm familiar with that work. I am not familiar with his other works. So, but for that book, I regard him as somewhat of a hero for writing 23
Yeah.
years.
Yeah, 23 years is the only book of his that I've personally read. And 23 years, just for people listening, wondering who would name a book 23 years, that is, according to the traditional Islamic historiography, the duration of the Prophet Muhammad ibn Abdullah's prophetic career. Jesus, 3 years, maybe four, but yeah, Muhammad, 23 years. And he writes this brilliant book, and he got in big trouble for it too, as an Iranian, living there, as someone who was kind of a reformed secular Muslim or something like that. But I mean, it's a brilliant book, and good news, you can Google that depending on what country you're in, and you can download the English language PDF of that. Uh, in most countries, not all countries, but in most countries you can find it. It's pretty easy to find online. So let me ask you a question, kind of just as a researcher to another researcher. What are like one or two of the most surprising things that you found or you came across when you were carrying out this research in the process of writing and everything? Like something that you came across and you're like, wow, that kind of changes my perspective, or that seems very important, and I did not know that.
I would say probably the material concerning the Ebionites or Ebionites. I'm not exactly sure how that is pronounced, which was a heretical Christian sect that has since, of course, long disappeared from the earth. And they had a gospel of their own that was never accepted. It was a heretical gospel called, I think, the Gospel according to the Hebrews. And there is evidence that Waraka ibn Naufal, the uncle, I think it was, of Khadija, Muhammad's first wife, was an Ebionite priest. And if that's true, and it appears to be, it explains, number one, why the Quran so often misstates or misassumes what Christian belief is in the process of refuting that belief. And so I think we also deal with that in chapter 3, the gospel according to the Hebrews, and what the Ebionites believed. And it just so happens that in setting up the Christian belief to be refuted, the Quran sets up Christian belief according to the gospel according to the Hebrews, the Ebionite book. And there's a pretty straight line connection between their beliefs and the Quran's refutation, supposedly, of Christian belief. So to me, that was fascinating, and I hadn't seen that discussed really much of anywhere else. So that was very
Yeah,
fascinating for me.
yeah, that's a great example. And we could give other examples. We're kind of coming down to the end of our interview time here, but of how Muhammad, I think that he had, received and heard just so many stories from Jews and maybe from Christians as well, that were kind of like hearsay. Just like if you go to kind of the average person who goes to church once or twice a year and you say, tell me the parable of the sower, they kind of might know some things, and then they'll tell it to you, and it'll have some of the correct elements, but obviously it'll have some elaborations or something that they added, or and but it's not the actual historical text in any way, shape, or form. So I mean, it just seems like this person, and I get to that when I hear him say things like the Quran, say things like "say not three," or like "do not worship Jesus or do not worship me." This is Jesus speaking. Me and my mother, in addition to Allah. It's like no Christians ever said that. I mean, yes, even the Christians who held Mary in high honor and venerated her as the mother of God incarnate, but nobody ever thought that Jesus said anything like that. So I mean, it just seems like he had kind of it's kind of like a game of telephone, I don't know if you remember
Yes.
that.
Yeah, I mean, I think,
Where we just said I have this story that's been handed on, and handed on and handed on, and some guy gets one of these corrupted messages and is like, oh, that's the Christians, that's the Jews.
yeah, I think probably, my working theory is that because so much of the world was illiterate, and Jews and Christians would hear the rabbi or the priest, give a teaching or a sermon or whatever, and it would be on some biblical passage, and as is very normal and natural, there would be elaboration and supplying of details that are not in the scripture, to fill out and make the sermon more understandable or whatever. And because the hearers were illiterate, they didn't know what was scripture and what was elaboration. And so they would recount those stories among themselves and among anyone else as though they were all scripture. And what's so interesting, and we talk about in chapter 3, is we can trace the stories in the Quran from the Old Testament, for example, and where they are different in detail, the Quran's details not being in the Old Testament, but being in the writings of the rabbis, the Talmud, the Mishnah, these other sources where you see a rabbi is expounding on some passage in the Torah and you see his elaborations. And if you're a literate person, you can see, oh, this is the scripture, this is the elaboration. But if you're illiterate, you don't know the difference. And so you include the elaborations. And so Muhammad would have heard Jews, for instance, telling stories of the Old Testament prophets. And those details that were elaborations appear in the Quran. And so you're left with either Muhammad just heard it and passed it off as revelation, or the Talmud and the Mishnah and these other sources are also divinely inspired, which goes completely
Mhm.
against Islamic teaching. And so this is part of what makes this so interesting for geeky people like you and me to
Yeah.
dive into things like that.
Yeah, so we've done a bit of exploration on chapter 3 particularly, but I want to assure everyone who's listening to this, that you're going to find the same sort of attention to detail and commentary in the other chapters. I mean, this is a brief interview on a book that is very expansive. So I want to encourage anyone listening to this to, get the book and read it, whether you are Muslim, Christian, or atheist, but who is interested in these questions. So Abdul Haq, we have time for one more question. And so just on a personal level, what are you hoping that God will do with this book in the world today? What's your prayer when you say, God, please do X, Y, and Z with this book?
Well, I hope on a sort of just an academic level that the book gets wide readership so that people are better educated, informed, knowledgeable, that kind of thing. I'm also hoping that it helps bring better understanding among Christian and Jewish and other readers of the authoritative text that Muslims wrestle with in some cases, debate about. It will help them understand the thinking of terrorists, who we so often dismiss as these just bloodthirsty demonic people. And I guess at some level that's true, but they feel that they are being obedient as best they know how to their authoritative scripture. And then I just would love for Muslims to be able to understand their book better, understand the arguments and the claims of skeptics and critics and non-Muslims about why this really may not be a divinely inspired book. But regardless, that they would know why people say the things they say about the Quran. and the challenges they raise to it. So, and as an evangelical, of course, I'm always hoping that all of my work brings people to the saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. Very simply.
Yeah, I remember hearing at a conference. It was a long time ago, so I don't remember who said it, but they said one of the greatest changes that has kind of opened Muslims towards possibly converting to the Christian faith is that all the hadith are online. And I thought that was fascinating. We could talk about it much more, but we're running out of time here. That's because a lot of these historical commentaries have always been revered, but no one's ever been able to like look at them and read them. And if you could find them, they were all in Arabic, but now we have them in all the major world languages. And you know, you really helped to bring us some of that hadith and commentary, tafsir, hadith. And so thank you very much. I appreciate your time, and just want to encourage everyone listening to this to pick up a copy of this book, The Quran's Difficult Verses Explained by Abdul Haqq. Thank you for your time.
Well, it's my pleasure. I will point out that it is the book is available in ebook format on Apple Books and Kobo and a few others, but it will also be on Amazon Kindle and Barnes and Noble Nook, God willing, within a few days. But the paperback is widely available everywhere, and I do encourage your listeners to pick up a copy and give it a good read.
Great.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been my honor.
My pleasure.